Hello and welcome to another episode of Stitching Tales. I am Johanna Lundström.
And I am Malena Hjerpe.
And we are the authors of the book Fit for Knits. And in our podcast we talk about all things sewing and also how to run your own sewing business. And when we first met, we met over the internet, and we do have one common interest, both of us, that is that we do sew a lot with knits, which is also the topic of our book. So in today's episode we want to talk about all things sewing with knits, and we're going to share some of the stuff that we are working on ourselves, some mistakes I'm sure, some of the struggles, and of course a lot of tips on how to be successful when you're sewing with knits. So Malena, do you remember your first ever knit garment that you sewed?
I do. The first garment I actually sewed was a knit garment. And yes, it was... I found it a few years ago and I tried it on. It was a pyjama, like a t-shirt and shorts. And it was so oversized on me as an adult. I sewed this when I must have been like 9 years old or something, but this was in the 90s, and you know, the fashion in the 90s was so oversized, and when I was younger, I was just skin and bone basically. So if it was oversized on me now when I'm adult, like how I don't understand, like how big must the garment have been when I was younger then. But yeah, I do remember it was blue and black, and yeah, it maybe it wasn't the most prettiest garment ever.
Did you make it on your sewing machine, or how did you construct it?
Yeah, it was on a regular sewing machine, so I just had like zigzag stitchings. But yeah, I remember it was fun to do. What was your first garment? Do you remember?
Yes, it was a Breton top or a sailor's top, which is like those wide stripe Marinos top. So it was in a cotton jersey, and it wasn't white and navy striped, it was white and apricot, because this was in the 80s. And I must have been 13 or 14 when I made it. And I had been making my own clothes for a while now, and I really liked, striped t-shirts and striped tops, which incidentally I'm also wearing right now. If you're watching the video on YouTube, because we also make this podcast as a video version, you can see that my taste hasn't changed much since in the last 35 years. But anyways, so it was a cotton jersey. I had no idea about sewing with knits. There were no resources back in the 80s for techniques and stuff like that. So I made it on my mother's vintage Singer sewing machine. It was a wedding gift to her in the 60s. And I also used a regular zigzag. And I remember I had two massive struggles. And the first one was the neckline. I think I tried to use a facing, like a big bulky facing. And I had no idea. It was maybe like 5 centimeters wide. And it was about 2 inches wide, so the facing on the inside, and I had no idea how to attach it because it was such a light jersey, so the facing was kind of bulky. So then I think I cut away the neckline, so it was like a boat neckline. So I cut the facing away, and instead I just folded back the seam allowance. So of course the neckline was a bit wider then, because I removed the seam allowance.
Bigger and
then I got bigger, and that was just before sewing. And then I just turned it back, and then I zigzagged around it, and then it was like gaping. But to me it was still like I was still happy with it because I managed to put it through. So that was my one struggle, and the second struggle was that I had no idea how to properly align the stripes. So if you would have looked from the side, you would see that the stripes were all over the place. I had no idea how to like mirror fabric and, be careful while sewing. So I don't think I was even bothered by that at all. But I do remember wearing it to school and thinking I was pretty cool. So I don't have that. Unfortunately, I haven't saved that one. But I definitely ran into a few common struggles when sewing with knits when I made my first stop, and then I took a bit of a break actually after that, and went back to wovens.
Yeah, it can be a little bit tricky sewing with knit fabric, definitely.
Yeah. So what we're going to talk about today is, of course, a lot of those things that we learned along the years, because we all are we're all beginners when we're starting out, right? So I think many of us has some stories up our sleeves, so to speak, when it comes to sewing with knits. It's definitely not a success story from the start. I think, in my opinion at least, I don't know what you say, I think sewing with knits is kind of deceptively easy. It's easy in one way because you don't have to do as many steps. There are less details. There are less you don't have to overcast edges usually. But you will run into a few issues when you're sewing with knits. So what are your struggles, for instance, Malena, when you're sewing with knits? What kind of issues do you tend to run into?
I think it's the stretch, definitely. I mean, that's the best thing and the worst thing, because the fabric it's alive. It reacts to what you do. So when you sew on a regular sewing machine, for example, and the needle pushes down, it could so easily also push down the fabric into the bobbin. What do you call it? So it's really easy that the fabric breaks or gets stuck in the machine or something if it's those really soft fabrics. So it's just to handle the fabric, I would say, can be really tricky on those really soft, and they have so much hand feel and so great drape and everything, but they are so difficult to work with if you don't have a serger. With a serger, it's so much easier.
Yeah, because those wonderful soft knits, or also those beautiful rib knits with tiny ribs that you can see sometimes in children's clothes, they are so wonderful to touch and feel, but they are extremely difficult to control because, as you say, they're very delicate. It's so easy to break if something gets stuck into it. Sometimes if you have to rip a seam, it's very easy to slip and then create a little bit of hole because the fabrics are so delicate, and also the fact that they are so difficult to control. So some fabrics that doesn't have a lot of recovery, they tend to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. So the longer you work on the project, the bigger it gets.
Yeah, and sometimes when you have sewn a seam and you have to unpick it, the fabric can so easily be damaged and stretched out and don't recover. So sometimes, to be honest, for example, if it's the neckline, it might be actually better to cut away the fabric if it's possible if it's okay that the neckline becomes a little bit bigger. That could actually be the best solution, because unpicking a seam can be really, really tricky on a knit fabric.
Yeah, it's very true. It's sometimes you can't recover it. You do have some great tips that we also share in our books, Fit for Knits, about how to steam back the fabric. And sometimes you can also, for instance, if something has grown uncontrollable, sometimes you can pull it back also with using, ribbing. You can pull it a little bit back like that because it can regain, but it's difficult sometimes to actually, sometimes it's irreversible if you have it would going to be wavy and you won't get a nicely shaped neckline. And also, I think some fabrics, they should always be finished with some type of ribbing rather than trying to finish the neckline by stitching it or hemming it, because it's just so much easier if you just add cuffs, for instance, at the sleeves, definitely, and at the neckline and at the waist. So that's also one of the things I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. On all my I have a few patterns that are for knits, and I always just have how to attach a neckband for the neckline, because I think folding in and sewing with a twin needle, I never get a good result. Fine in the front, when it's a little bit straighter, but then when you have those curves, it's just you get those drag lines because it's it doesn't it's not really suitable sometimes for those kind of fabrics to fold and not on curved seam. You can't really fold and just sew with a twin needle. On the bottom hem, it's much easier to fold and then sew with a twin needle. Yeah, I never do that on the neckline. It's too difficult.
Yeah, it is very, very difficult. I find the only method that I find that works on some necklines is that if you, which I should also say that I show this method in my book Sewing Activewear, is that you first attach a narrow strip of clear elastic along the edge of the neckline. So the clear elastic is about 5 millimeters, so it's about 1/4 of an inch, I think. You first attach it to the inside of the neckline, and then you fold it over, so the neckline is the neckline folded is just the width of the clear elastic, so it's super, super narrow. And then you can top stitch it using a zigzag stitch or twin needle. It's a method that is quite advanced, but I find that is one of the few methods that can, if you're working with a very stretchy, like lycra fabric, for instance, activewear, you can use it for leg openings and sleeveless tops. That's probably the only way, honestly, to control it, because then you still keep the stretch due to the clear elastic. And also you need to use very thin, lightweight clear elastic, because otherwise if you're top stitching over it, you might end up getting skip stitches because it's too many layers and the needle might have, or it's too thick, so it might have problems top stitching. But that is probably the only method that I think is doable, honestly, unless you're using...
it stabilizes the seam and it's much easier to sew, yeah.
Yeah.
Have you ever tried the...
And of course...
that like instead of pinning with pins or needles, you glue and you can wash away the glue. For example, if you fold the hem and have glued or anything. Have you tried that?
Yes, I used that.
Yeah.
Yes, I have used different methods. I haven't tried it so much for neckline because that's the shaping I usually baste if I prefer that. But I have 3 different things that I use. Regular stick glue, the one you can buy in stores, because it's usually very easy to wash away. Secondly, if you want to ensure that the product is suitable fabric, is to buy a basting stick, which is a basting glue, either a pen or you can also spray, I think, but I use the pen. And the third is, which doesn't work on shaped seam, it only works on straight seam, is to use something called Wonder Tape, which is a double-sided, narrow, washable tape. So it will get removed once you wash it, but you have to be very careful. I wouldn't recommend ironing over big heat or anything like that. So you have to definitely remove the tape as soon as it's done. But it's stitchable, so if it's a good quality tape, you can top stitch over it. So it's great if you're having problems with stretch out hemming, for instance. You can use the Wonder Tape. I find that really helpful. But actually, regular uncolored glue stick that you buy, it works.
Okay, I never tried that actually.
It's just starch, basically.
Yeah, cool.
But always do a sample, right?
Obviously.
Yeah, I don't come for me unless it doesn't work. But it's a pretty, there are some ways of doing that. And I also baste I baste a lot when I'm sewing with it. For instance, if I'm doing hems, I am a big fan of basting, but that also prevents the hemline from stretching out and getting those diagonal drag lines, because you might have problems with uneven feeding. And I find that if I baste, I have much more control. So usually combination of basting and a couple of pins. That's how I usually do it to be successful.
Yeah, and you said feeding the feeding dogs on the machine. My 2 biggest best sewing tips are that, well, first check the pressure. I can't say this. Pressure. No. The pressure.
Yeah. Pressure foot pressure.
Because usually, especially if you sew with woven, like you can have a lot of pressure on the presser foot. But if you are sewing with knits, it's gonna be too much pressure, and then the feeding dogs is gonna pull out the fabric, and they also are gonna pull more the underlayer compared to the top layer. So that's why you get those drag lines, and also the seam gets so stretched out and becomes wavy. So loosen up the pressure a little bit when you sew with knit, and this especially for home sewing like regular machines, but also on sergers or overlockers. I really recommend this. And the second, like always do this, is pressing with an iron. Lots and lots of steam. Like I spend equally much of time with my iron that I do with my sewing machine, because every seam I first, especially if I use a really soft jersey fabric, I sew the seam and then I press the seam when it's like closed, so it regain its it recovers, so it doesn't so it's not wavy anymore, and then I open it up and like press open the seam, and I always do it from the wrong side, because the knitting structure can be damaged if you press it too hard with an iron, and it gets like these shiny marks, so that can be really difficult to get out, or and it doesn't look so nice. So always a lot of steam and from the wrong side. I think that's the best way to get like a really good, so it doesn't look home sewn, if you know what I mean.
That's such a great tip, because I think maybe not everyone is aware of that. You need to press knits, because you might have this, because we all know or have been taught that we should press as we go when we sew with wovens. You know, you press open the seam allowance, you press like everything. There's a very specific method and routine to doing that, but to get that, as Malena says, the professional result, you definitely need to use an iron when sewing with knits as well, because otherwise the seams won't look flat, and you get ridges. It doesn't, and the sleeves, everything looks like unfinished. As you want those flat seams, and it's also important, as you say, to press on the go, because normally when you're sewing sleeves on knit patterns, you do it on the flat, meaning that you first attach the sleeve cap to the armhole before sewing the side and the sleeve seam. So it's very easy to press that sleeve because you're doing it on the flat, so you don't even need to have like a sleeve iron board, because you can just press it flat. So that's also another thing why it's so important to press as you go, because once you finish the garment, it will be much more difficult to access stuff. And same with neckline as well, because you attach the neckline as soon as you sewn the shoulder seams. So again, it's flat, so it's much easier to press and shape than if you had already sewn the full garment. You're like, maybe I should do some pressing.
Yeah, and I always the only exception I think would be like swimwear, like those kind of lycra fabric. I mean, those are difficult to press. But otherwise, I always start before I even cut the fabric. I always press it so it's nice and flat, and then after I sew a couple of seams and then I press them. Like I always press it before you sew over that previous seam, if that makes sense. So it's really huge. It makes a huge difference. Like it really regains its because they're always going to be stretched out when you sew. Like even with an overlocker, they are going to be stretched out and become a little bit wavy. But that usually recovers when you have steam and heat. So I really recommend it.
Yeah, and also, as you mentioned, some fibers are quite delicate, so I should definitely also do a little bit of a test before you start ironing, because usually you need really low heat on most knit fabrics, I find, to still get good result. And even if it's made with natural fiber, it's usually have some spandex or lycra content, which is much more sensitive to heat. So you still have to be careful with the pressing. So I wouldn't go, even if you're making like a cotton t-shirt, I wouldn't go for the cotton setting. If you have an iron that labels that, I would definitely go for a lower setting and test and see, as Malena says, also if you get those pressing marks, which can be permanent. So I definitely, that's my experience, that you must, it's much better to go lower compared to the same type of fiber composition on a woven fabric.
Yeah, and most of the time you sew with polyester threads, and they are, polyester is plastic, so that can melt if you have too high heat. So it's more safer to start with a lower setting.
Yeah. So press as you go. It's just like everyone has always told you, and sometimes I forget, and I always regret it. I think that's one of the things. Even though I mean we are both very experienced sewing, but sometimes you can get in that flow where you're like everything is such a nice flow that you just want to keep on sewing, and I can iron later. I can just want to do that, and you always forget yourself. So it's also good to have your for like mental to make it easier mentally is to set up your iron station before, like the iron board, and plug in that iron before you start sewing, because if you need to set everything up when you're sewing, you might postpone it.
Yeah, and I actually, when we are talking about, I was in my studio yesterday sewing some samples, and obviously had my iron on. And I think my best buy ever is a little timer that I like plug in my iron to, so you can have it like it switches off automatically after 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. And now when we are talking about pressing, I was like, shoot, I did some pressing yesterday. Did I unplug my iron? Yes, I know I did, but I have this safety, like, after 3 hours, it switches off anyway. So that is actually a really good thing to buy. It's nothing sewing related, actually, but it's a good thing to have because, it's so easy to forget to unplug your iron.
Yeah, that's a great tip. And I'm one of those persons that keep thinking I should buy one of those timers, but I never do. But I promise, until the next podcast episode, I will get one of those timers, because also I have my own sewing studio. If you're watching the video, you can see it behind me, and it's not located in my home, so there's no chance I will pass by in an hour later and see that the iron is on, because I've already walked home and will probably not be back until the next day. So yeah, it's definitely a very, very nice, very important tip to have.
Yeah, only annoying thing is at first I had it for like 1 hour and then it would switch off. But then when you start to iron, it's like, why is nothing happening? It's like, oh, right, it switches off again and again and again. So now I have it on 3 hours, so I can do some proper sewing during that time.
That's a very wonderful tip. I agree with you, because it's so annoying. And some iron also tends to like auto close off, so you lose all the heat. So you have to like start again. I have one of those like steaming stations, so they shut themselves down.
It's like, thanks,
which is
no.
good, but it's also really annoying that you have to start waiting for it to heat up again, like for a really long time. And another thing that we briefly mentioned was the sewing order. I thought it was really interesting to talk about when you're sewing tops, for instance, because there is a very distinct sewing order that also is different from woven fabrics. So I would say start with the shoulder seam, because that's the first seam that will keep everything together. And secondly, I say sew the neckline before you're stitching the sleeves or sewing the sleeve. Would you agree with me, Malena, on that?
Yeah, I mean, technically you can do either way, but I think it's so much easier to do the neckline first, because you have basically less fabric to handle if you haven't attached the sleeves yet.
Yeah, and also if you are working with one of those soft, wonderful, lovely cotton fabrics or bamboo fabrics and stuff that tends to grow, the more you fill with the fabric and doing other stuff, for instance inserting the sleeve, there's an increasing chance that the neckline will stretch out when you're handling the rest of the garment. So that's why I also think it's a good idea to start with the neckline as soon as possible to avoid those issues as well. So so start with the shoulder seam, then do the neckline, and then we do the sleeves.
Yeah.
And as I say, we sew it on the flat. Why would I say that it's better to sew it on the flat than sewing the sleeves first and then inserting them like you would on a woven top or blouse?
Oh, sorry. I think it's just easier when you have negative ease on the sleeve head. It's easier to insert it that way and it also goes a little bit faster pinning it, and then you sew the side seam and the sleeve in side seam in one continuous seam, and that's basically just how you do it in the like in the industry. So that is it's a little bit easier, quicker way to do it.
Yeah, it's easier also because it can be a little bit when you already have like two circles that you need to fit into each other. I also find it much more difficult to control and evenly distribute the sleeve seam line towards the armhole sleeve line, because it's just much more fiddlier. But and trying to find the notches to them align when everything is flat and nice, you can really just gauge exactly where the shoulder seam notch is, where the front seam front armhole notch is, and the back. So it's much easier, I find, to just have control and like visually align everything. There's less risk of twisting the sleeve when you're sewing, because you have to, like, especially if you're working on a tight fitting top, you don't have much space because you have like this really narrow, and then you're going to try to sew when you have to like fiddle, and you're going to stretch something out. And even worse, if you're working a serger, if you get like a second layer of fabric underneath and then the knife cuts through it. Yes, raise your hands if that happens. So I have many of those garments, especially I think the first couple of years when I got myself a serger. That was like I always got my heart racing when I was attaching the sleeves, because it was like, I ended up getting, because sometimes I cut into the arm, the front piece, when I was at the curve here. So I went to a store and bought this really cute flower appliques. So I attached them on only one. I should perhaps do it symmetrically and also put it on the other side, but I only put it on one side. I don't know why, what my thinking process was about that, but so it's like, if that happens to you, if you're okay with having some appliques or something like that, you can save your garment if it's just a tiny. But it's hard to mend a stretchy fabric that has been cut through. It's very difficult to fix it in other ways.
So annoying when you realize it. It's just like, oh yeah, no, I've been there, done that a couple of times.
Yeah, so go slow. Even though the serger is a fast, crazy machine, there's no harm in going slow when you're inserting sleeves, because it's much better to sew a little bit, just slightly adjust the pieces, sew a little bit more, making sure that the knives are aligning at the fabric edge and cutting properly, and also to ensure that it's cut evenly. So you don't have to rush through those steps, because it won't get better just because you do it faster. I mean, it's much better to go slow, sew for a little bit, adjust, because it's like adventurous trail, right? Trying to sew the sleeve, because it happens a lot. There's all different curves and winding things happening. It's not a straight line.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Go slow on that. And I would say something that really is helpful is preparing. Also, after you sew the side seam and the sleeve, if you have a long sleeve t-shirt or a children's t-shirt or something, like the bottom hem at the sleeve can be really small and tight, and that can be really tricky to hem. So you can hem that first and then you sew the inseam, because then it's already hemmed and it's going to be a lot easier to get a nice seam, basically. And I always again I press the hem first before I sew it, and I always press it like before I sew the side seams, because then I can have the bottom hem, for example, then I can have it flat on the ironing board, and it's just so much easier to fold up and steam it, compared to if you have sewed already both seams, and then you have a circle basically that you need to fold, and it's just a lot trickier to do it. So I always prep it before, and then I can use a lot less needles as well when I actually sew, because it actually stays in place already. So that's a really,
Yeah.
I really recommend it.
Yeah, that's a fantastic tip. I think, as you say, it's so much easier. And also measuring the fold to ensure that it's even, so it's not like wider in one space. It's also so much easier when you're doing it on the flap, because then you can just check everything. Whereas when you have this round shape, it's really, really difficult to get exact even fold all over, especially on the narrow sleeves. So that's a great suggestion. Also, if you're sewing leggings that has like a very narrow leg opening, again, using the method Malena describes to first hem, or at least press up the hem before you stitch. That helps so much, because it's so difficult. It's also easy to stretch out the fabric because you have to navigate such narrow. It doesn't really, regardless if you're using a regular sewing machine or a cover stitch, it's still such a narrow circle that it's very, very difficult to not accidentally stretch it out when you're moving that tiny little tube around. So it can definitely help, and you don't have to worry because the seam will still be enclosed. I think the only tricky bit is that you have to be really mindful to make sure that the seams align, so you don't get like a half a centimeter or a centimeter or a quarter of an inch that one is longer, because that's going to be really visible. So you have to really make sure that they are aligned, and have some pin at the end or something like that, because sometimes, as it's easy that one layer stretches out a little bit more. So that's the only, I think, issue that you might run into. And of course you need to secure the seam as well, but I do it a lot as well, because it just makes things so much easier.
And if you do want to hem it after you've sewn the inside seam, just fold the whole garment inside out, because then it's easier also, I think, to hem a narrow bottom sleeve hem or something, to have it if you have it inside out.
So you're basically having the folded hem towards you, up towards you when you're sewing, instead of sewing from the right side. I totally agree with that. It gives you more control and also prevents the less risk of stretching out. So these are the kind of things that no one told us, right, when we started sewing with knits. That's why we're talking about this today, because there's so many of this kind of like insights that you get after a while, and you find out someone has shown this method, or you realize it yourself. So a lot of these kind of tiny things that makes a huge difference. And so there's like, also it's good to say that each method, it works for different people. So maybe for you can try something different, but if you're having struggles, for instance, with hemming, I definitely recommend the kind of method that we are talking about right now. Should we talk a little bit about different type of machines as well? Because you do have at least 3 different machines, to my knowledge, to pick from.
Yes, that I use.
Yes, you use, and I do too.
I might have others as well, but they're not in use. I'm not hoarder. I'm trying to be not.
I actually did a video about that, because I have 3 different machines, and and as I usually, because when you tell people they don't sew, they're like, what? Why do you have 3 different machines? I mean, how many machines do you need to sew? It's like, you do need 3. But it was so fun in the comments on that YouTube video where I did a studio tour. There were people like having 10 different machines, because and there's also machines that can do like buttonholes, for instance. There are very many specialty machines if you want to go that route, or heavy duty machines if you want to sew with leather or very like thick fabric. So if you go all in on this hobby, so to speak, you can definitely go crazy, because there are so many different options. But we have 3 machines in use, we should say. So I guess everyone has a sewing machine, which is a question that I get a lot. Can I make a knit garment if I only have a sewing machine and no serger or a cover stitch machine? And what would you say to that question, Malena?
Yes, you can. I mean, you're not gonna get as nice seams as if you would have a serger or overlocker, but yes, you can you can absolutely make them, because the zigzag seam is very stretchy. So you definitely can get a long way with that. And then actually, when I like looked at my bought underwear, for example, with that has like a lace edge, it's actually sewn with just a zigzag. So yeah, they do it in the industry as well.
Yeah, it's great because it has so much stretch because of the zigzag. There's so much thread and stitching, so when you stretch it out, it gets straighter and straighter, which gives why it has so much give. Because if you're using a regular straight stitch on it, as soon as you stretch it out, the seam will break because there's no extra thread that can. It works like, because the thread almost works like a coil. You have to, when you, if the coil has those coils, right? I think it's called. As if you don't know, English is not our first language. We are both Swedish speaking, so sometimes we get a little bit lost for word. But spring, I think spring is the thing, and coils are what is make the spring. So it's basically the same principle. So you can think of the thread as the coil in a spring. So if there's more thread loops in an area, there will be more stretch, for instance. So that's why a straight stitch doesn't work, because there's no give, there's nothing that can be stretched out. So it's basically, it doesn't work like a spiral or something elastic like that. So that's why it's so important that you need to have a different kind of seam. A lot of modern and fairly modern sewing machine also have an overlock seam that looks kind of similar to serger or overlocker seam. My personal I think it's very durable and has great stretch, but it's usually an absolute nightmare to rip. So that's my opinion of it. I like it, but you have to be sure that you know what you're doing, because if something's wrong, you're going to ruin the fabric if you're using a delicate fabric. At least that's my experience. What's your take on those like sewing machine overlock seams?
Yeah, I have actually never like used them since I always had an overlocker. But yeah, I can only imagine how difficult it's going to be to unpick them. And I also, don't they stretch out the edge quite a lot if you sew really close to the edge, or do you still sew a little bit away from the edge?
No, it's basically meant to enclose the edge.
Yeah.
So it's usually have around like a quarter of an inch or 5 millimeter width. So it's usually called overlock.
Okay,
So it's
yeah.
meant as opposed to,
Yeah.
but it's.
I mean, if you don't have a serger, it's a great seam to use, because they are really. I can imagine that they look really like they are going to stretch a lot.
Yeah, they have fantastic stretch. So it's basically the sewing machine is going back and forth, creating that kind of stretch that is similar to a serger overlock seam. But of course, because there's so much going back and forth, that's also why you have so many stitches, which makes it really difficult to rip. But it's definitely a good option, I think, because you will get a really nice finish if you want that, because then it will cover the edges if you're using. You can also, of course, use a wider seam allowance and then trim away the extra fabric as well. So you can try and see, because sometimes if it overlocks the edges, there's also a tendency of the fabric getting stuck inside the lower part of the sewing machine where the bobbin area is. So you have to be a bit careful with that as well, which you don't have when you're using a serger in the same way, that it won't get pulled through inside.
Yeah, and a good thing to mention when if you use a regular sewing machine, there is usually like a universal needle or a woven needle as a default needle, but you have to have a stretch needle or a ballpoint needle when you sew with jersey, because then the tip of the needle is going to be rounded. On a regular needle, it's going to be very pointy when you sew with woven. And if you use a pointy needle when sewing with knits, it can break the threads in the fabric, and then you get a hole, and that can what do you say? Like it could spread the hole, like unravel.
Yeah, it unravels almost.
Yeah, but if you have a rounded needle, it like it gets in between the the fabric, so then it doesn't create a hole. It actually just goes in between all the fabric. So that's a really good thing to have a specific jersey needle, and it also can prevent from what is it? Jumping stitch? No, what do you say?
Skip stitches.
Yeah, skip stitches. Yeah. So the needle is very important to have. And if you ever like accidentally hit when you sew and you hit the needle that you have, like a pinning needle, a good thing is to actually change the sewing machine needle, because it probably has been damaged at the edge then, and then it could create holes as well. And you usually don't see these holes in the fabric because they are so small, but then after you wash the garment, then it's going to be visible. And then it's so sad that you have spent so much time making the whole garment, and it's like just tiny holes everywhere.
Yeah, and they're so difficult to mend. Sometimes you can do it using like a regular sewing thread if in the matching, but it's very difficult, I find. So hopefully you could fix it like mending it, especially if it's close to the seam. You won't see it if it's on the side seam, but it does happen. And also needle size, if you're working with a really delicate thin knit fabric, definitely go down the needle size as well, because I find that can also prevent those holes from forming if you're using a needle that is a bit too large as well. So it's a little bit trickier for sure. But yeah, I totally agree with you, Malena. Use a ballpoint needle. I think technically a universal needle is a ballpoint needle, but it isn't round enough for knit fabrics. So you should definitely, even though it says universal, it's not really universal.
It's more towards the woven.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a misnomer. So that's a really good tip as well. Then we talked about sewing machine, and then I think the next machine that you might consider if you get into sewing with knits is a serger, or an overlocker, as we say in Europe in many countries. So Malena, why should we get an overlocker or a serger?
You get really nice seams and nice finishes of the seams, and it's really like, sure, it can just do one thing, but it does that really well. And sure, with a little different settings, you can have like a baby lock that is a little bit thinner and those kind of things. But it's really, I love my overlocker. It's the machine that I absolutely use the most. And I have not Bernina. I have a Bernina regular home sewing machine, and then it's their own overlocker as well. So I think it's called Burnett. I'm not really sure, but it's like 25 years old or something. It's like, it was white in the beginning, but now the plastic has turned all yellowy, but it's still going like so good. So I love it. It's a good investment, definitely.
Yeah. They don't seem to break as much, overlockers. They seem to be really sturdy workhorses.
Yeah, if you have I had one cheaper overlocker as well, but it just, I don't know, it was something with the set. It didn't work at all as the seams were. There were a lot of issues with it. So I think like quality machine is absolutely the way to go here. And I would always recommend get a second-hand quality machine compared to a new cheap machine, because the quality is it's worth it, definitely.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And also should be a bit careful, because at least here in Sweden, I think that's common in many countries, some bigger grocery stores, they sometimes have they sell sewing machines, and also I've seen sergers, and sometimes they are very cheap, and they can have like a famous brand name, but I do suspect that they are the lower end of that, because I know people that have bought sewing machines that way from like a grocery store campaign, like the monthly offer, and they seem to usually have many issues. So I don't really feel comfortable buying a sewing machine in a grocery store as well. Plus, of course, if you have any issues, you can't go to the milk section and ask someone to. You probably have to send it to the manufacturer instead. So you won't get like a skilled professional to turn to, and I can only imagine having to deal with the warranty issues if you buy yourself your sewing machine at like a grocery store. But it's pretty common to see that, so definitely buyers beware. I very much agree with Malena. Much better to get a used sewing machine if money is tight, and you will get a really nice quality. My serger is the Baby Lock, which was insanely expensive. That's the most expensive sewing machine I have gotten. It's the Baby Lock Ovation, and it cost, like a cheap used car. Like a bad used car. But again, people have had this machine for decades, and they are so fond of it. So I'm very happy with my investment as well. I've had it for about 8 years now, and it's been running like clockwork extremely well. So it's something I highly recommend. Again, to buy the brands that get the good reviews, and that people that you trust are also recommending. I definitely agree with you. Another benefit about using a serger is that it's so fast, right?
Yeah, it's really fast.
So it's incredibly, if you're sewing a straight seam, you basically just hit the pedal and then you're done.
Yeah.
Whereas, for instance, if you're using a sewing machine and those overlock stitches that I talked about previously, because sewing machine has to go back and forth and maybe sideways, just sewing a couple of centimeters will take like forever. And the third thing, which I also think is so good about the serger, is the fact that you have the differential feed, which controls the speed of the feed dogs. Because one of the most common thing that you have, as you mentioned earlier, Malena, is that the fabric will get stretched out when you're sewing. But by controlling the speed of the feed dogs, you can prevent the fabric from stretching out. So, for instance, if you working with a fabric that is tends to stretch out, you can increase differential feed a little bit, and then it will be pulled together automatically. So again, you should always do a test sample to see, because it can be very different depending on so for instance, a lot of knit fabrics have less stretch lengthwise, even though they're four-way stretch, than crosswise. So if you're sewing a side seam, you usually can use the regular, like normal differential feed. But if you would do like a cross seam, for instance, on a garment where you have like a horizontal seam, like a yoke or anything like that, I would say that maybe you could try to see if the increasing differential feed might prevent from getting wavy seams. So there's no like one setting that works all the time. You need to experiment, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's really, and that's why it's so good to do tests, and also pull the seam on the test, so you see that even though like, yes, it looks very nice and it hasn't stretched out anything, but maybe it's even too tight, then it doesn't stretch anything, like it doesn't have enough stretch. So definitely try to stretch the seam as well to see how good they are.
Yeah, because when you're sewing with knits, stretchy knits, you want to keep the stretch. You don't want anything to be rigid, because then you're working against the fabric and not with it.
No, absolutely.
And then we have the third machine, which is probably the next up on the ladder. And speaking about a machine that only do one thing, it's even more specific, because at least with the serger, you can also hem. You can do like a rolled hem. You can do like blind hem stitching. You can also, of course, finish the edges of woven fabric as well, so you get a really nice professional finish. So a serger is a bit more versatile. But a cover stitch machine, what does that do, Malena? And why should we get one?
Well, it basically just does hems, I think. It could also, of course, you could sew like bindings with it. And I actually have that. I bought it when I bought my cover lock. I also bought the really, it looks so advanced, the thing that you attach so you can like sew nice bindings. I still haven't used it, and it was like 3-4 years ago since I bought it. Yeah, any day, we'll see.
Yeah, it's definitely a learning curve. And if you're struggling with sewing binding, I have many resources I can recommend. First of all, you can check out my book, master the cover stitch machine, you can also go to my website, theloststitch.com, where I have a tutorial where I talk about the different things that you can try if you're struggling. And I also have a video sewing course, Cover Stitch Success, where I also talk about how to be successful with binding and, you know, the kind of settings you need to experiment with and all the placements and everything. So there's definitely a learning curve when it comes to sewing binding, but it's very, very popular finish, especially if you're sewing like children's clothes or activewear. Sometimes binding is a better way to finish the neckline and the sleeve openings. And I have a friend, Erika's Syscreen, which is a store here in Sweden. She sells cover stitch equipment, like attached binders and everything like that, and she sells globally, so you can definitely check her out. Erika's Syscreen. She's also on Instagram, and she has actually she's a binding pro, so she's now finishing hems, the bottom of the hems. So when I visited her in her shop recently, she had finished like a tunic with binding, and I think she also had like a children's skirt that was also finished with the contrasting binding, and it looked really cool. Yeah. So that if you already have your sewing machine set on binding and you don't want to remove the attachment, because then there's nothing on the garment that you need to use the cover stitch for a regular fold up hem. So you basically just bind the neckline, the sleeve openings, and the hem.
Yeah, because that's I think the biggest, I don't want to set up it for just one seam and then remove it to be able to sew the other hem if I like do a binding on the neckline and then have to remove it after just one seam. It just seems like I don't know, so much time to just set it up, but I haven't tried it, so I don't know how fast you can do it.
Yeah, it's definitely because of the placement. It's really nice to do multiple projects when you have set it up, because usually you need to be really meticulous about the placement and the stitch settings depending on what type of fabric you're using. So it can, I see you and I hear you, and I don't use it as much as I probably should either, because again of the same reason, that it's just too much fiddling. Yeah, as you said, Malena, it's basically just made for hemming, and you can also use. It has a single seam, the chain stitch, which you can also use for like top stitching and decorative purposes as well. And you can also use it for basting because it's very easy to remove. So usually, cover stitch machine, most modern cover stitch machine usually have a setting where you can either use one needle, which is a chain stitch, or two needle, which is like a two needle cover stitch, which is what you see on pretty much all professionally made knit garments. And then most modern ones have three needles, so you can either get the 3 rows or you can reverse it and get, if you sew the straight stitches on the reverse side, you will get the decorative overlock seam on the looped overlock seam on the right side. And now there are more advanced versions that do a top cover stitch as well, so you get this really, when you look at like modern activewear, you will see that the hems are sewn with a much more intricate threads, so they're not like 2 needles or 3 needles. It's that similar to the reverse side, but on the right side. So I think it's usually called a top cover stitch, which has a 5th thread spool. So those are like the most modern machines. I don't have those myself, but next machine I get, I will probably get one of those. But I know it's a learning curve. I've used it in the past, and it's a little bit tricky to get it right.
Yeah, I would say that those are more like industrial machines. It's not so common to have as a home sewing machine, I would say.
You don't need it. I think you will do very nicely with the. I think most have 3 needles today if you get one, so I think you will be more than happy with that. So, yeah. So I wouldn't say you need to have a cover stitch machine, but
no, I mean, I got one 3-4 years ago, and so yeah, I managed without, and I've been sewing. Since I was very young. So I mean, definitely, if you want to have nice hems on knits. But it's not like you get by with a regular sewing machine and a serger like you will be fine with those two machines.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can on a regular sewing machine, you can use the twin needle stitch, or you can use a zigzag stitch, or you can use my favorite if you're using a more stable fabric, the blind hem stitch. So you get a really invisible stitch on the outside. And on a serger, you could do a roll hem, or the lettuce hem. So the kind of wavy curved. There's usually also a blind hem stitch function that you can use on a serger as well. And you can also just simply overlock the edges and just leave them raw like that. Just with so you can basically finish. There are ways of finishing, or you can combine if you like the finish of the. You can first overlock the edge of the fabric and perhaps use the differential feed a little bit higher, because then it pulls the fabric back, and then you can press it in and top stitch it on a sewing machine using the twin needle, because then you get the best of both worlds. You get the overlock will help the fabric to keep its shape, and you will get a really nice finish. So it looks a bit more professional, because you don't see the zigzag will be hidden because it's hidden by the overlock seam. So if you have a serger and a sewing machine, you can get like really nice result.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can do so many things with those two machines. Absolutely.
I think we've spoken now for about an hour about sewing with knits, because we keep joking that we can talk forever about sewing, and I think every episode that we do, we definitely prove that is how we do it. So, but we should also say that if you want to learn more about us and the stuff that we do have several things and offerings that pertains to knits. For instance, Malena, you have several sewing patterns made for knits, right?
Yeah. Have started with the basics and have joggers and t-shirts, and now I'm working on a little more not advanced top, but it has a little bit more details at the front, so that I'm really looking forward to that.
And I also have sewing patterns, a cardigan and a pair of leggings and a puff top. If you're watching the video version of this, I'm wearing this girly with puff sleeves. So it's a long sleeve and a short sleeve version. But also I have so many resources when it comes to sewing with knits. I have 2 books that are talking about that I've written myself. We're going to talk about the 3rd book soon. I have a book called Sewing Activewear, which talks about how to sew with knits, and also Master the Cover Stitch Machine, which talks also only about how to use the cover stitch machine with lots of tutorials. And me and Malena has written a book together, which is called Fit for Knits. And should we mention a little bit about what that book is about?
Yeah, I mean, it's mainly about, getting good fitted knitted garment, like how to do pattern adjustments, but also we talk a lot about how to sew with knits, because we are talking about this for an hour now. The seams affect so much when you sew with knits. So we definitely had a lot of things to cover in the book for how to get good seams, basically. And you also have so much information on your blog. Like when I Google something, it's usually your blog that comes up.
That's wonderful to hear. Yes, I have it's like a separate category just with the tutorials for how to sew with knits. And also you can check out my YouTube channel, The Last Stitch TV, where I also have lots of tutorials on how to sew with knits, from everything from a regular sewing machine to serger or cover stitch machine. So I think between us, we have you covered when it comes to sewing with knits. So, and if we don't, just drop us a note and we can see if we can make that into some further content or maybe a topic on this show. Thank you so much for listening or watching. As we said, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can also listen to this in your regular podcast app. And if you want to see how we look like when we are doing this podcast, and you can hop over to my YouTube channel, The Last Stitch TV, and then you can see the video version of this pod.